Her name, it's a slur. Call someone a Jezebel, and it means promiscuous, manipulative, evil. She's been the villain of Sunday school lessons for 2,000 years. But who was she really when we tear behind the veil, when we look behind the veil? She was a Phoenician princess. She married the king of Israel, and she was the daughter of a priest king who seized power through assassination. And she brought 450 prophets of a foreign god to Samaria. And she was so powerful that the greatest prophet in the Bible, Elijah, he ran for his life from her. But could be that most of what you do think about Jezebel, just from a lot of the caricature that's been built over the years, may be wrong in some sense. That we know she wasn't a prostitute, but the view is she was a seductress based on really one story when she's at the window with Jehu below. But we don't have hard evidence that she was going around seducing people. And in essence, we know she was something really far more dangerous to the biblical writers. She was a powerful, educated foreign queen, and she refused to abandon her gods. And we're going to go deeper. We're going to really get the real story of Jezebel. But first, please subscribe to Supernatural History. Really helps out a lot. Turn on notifications, and we'll see you soon in the next one. But let's get deeper onto Jezebel. This is going to be really eye-opening, and really to understand her, you really need to go back and look and understand Tyre, the city she came from. Tyre, it was an island city off the coast of what is now modern-day Lebanon, and it was one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world. The Phoenicians, they were master traders in the Mediterranean. They controlled the purple dye trade, which is hard as it is to fathom. It was more valuable than gold. And they were the chief traders. They had those roots down. They were very adept in purple dye, and it was so valuable at the time. Super wealthy group of people, nation. And they built ships. They'll sell to Spain, Britain, and probably even beyond that we know about. And their alphabet, really, it's the basis. It's the ancestor of the one that we're talking right now in English, probably other languages as well. But they had a lot of intellect as well. They were very smart people. And so Tyre's wealth was really legendary. The prophet Ezekiel describes it in chapter 27 as a ship. It was made of the finest materials. I mean, planks from Sinir, a mast from Lebanon, oars from Bashan, sails from Egypt. So it was a city of merchants, artisans, priests. At the head of the city was a man named Baal. So Baal, or also known as Baal the first, he wasn't born king, and according to Phoenician historian Menander, he preserved in the writings of Josephus. Baal was a priest of Astarte, and she was the Phoenician god of love, war, and fertility, the same Astarte that we discussed in the video we did actually on the origins of the trans movement, and so on the ancients' origins on what you call the third gender. That Astarte was key in that she was probably the launch pad for that entire movement. And as a priest of Astarte, Baal would have been one of the most powerful men in Tyre. So the temple and the palace, they were deeply connected in Phoenician society, no real separation of church and state. But at some point he decided that this temple is not enough, and he started looking at his neighbors and looking for opportunities. And according to records, Baal, he assassinated the previous king, Phelis, and took the throne of Tyre. He was already the Sidonian king, so took the neighbor in Tyre, and he ruled for 32 years there. And so during his reign, Tyre reached the absolute height of its power. And then he founded new colonies, he expanded trade, and he also made alliances with rising kingdoms around him, which included Israel. And then, as I said, with Israel, he sealed that alliance with a marriage, and being his daughter Jezebel marrying Ahab, of course, the king of Israel at the time. But this is one thing I don't think most people realize, that Baal was a priest of Astarte before he was a king. And so his daughter was really entrenched in this. She was raised in a palace that was also a temple before it was a palace, in essence. So religious devotion, it wasn't a private matter to her. It was really the way she was brought up, the air she breathed, so to speak. And Baal had schooled her in that regard. And so Jezebel's marriage to Ahab, it was a diplomatic masterstroke, really. And the Omride dynasty, which was Ahab's family, they were relatively sort of new to power, new on the block. Ahab's father Omri had founded the dynasty and built Samaria as its new capital. And so they really needed to get some allies. They needed to spread their tentacles through the region. And so Tyre was a natural partner for that process. In Israel, they had access to trade routes that actually Tyre needed as well. So it was really a good relationship on both ends. And so with Tyre getting this access to the Mediterranean, and then the alliance, as I said, it was really mutually beneficial for both. And so when the Bible records this marriage in 1 Kings 16:31, and is presented as Ahab's great sin, that entire marriage. But when you look at it really just from a political standpoint, it's really sort of akin to, similar to the alliance that Solomon had made with Egypt and Hiram of Tyre generations earlier. So in many ways, there was a template already involved there. And Jezebel, when she arrived in Samaria, she didn't arrive really as a foreigner, sort of begging for refuge, but she was a queen representing one of the most powerful empires in that region. So she brought so much cachet, respect as queen immediately. And then she also, as I said, she brought this religion with her. But it wasn't really necessarily out of spite, but that was the custom at the time. As the Phoenician royal woman, they were expected to serve as goddesses of their, or as priestesses of their goddess Astarte. And in fact, Ahab, he ended up building a temple for Baal in Samaria, and it literally meant the house of Baal was the name of it. And he also made an Asherah pole. And this wasn't just Jezebel forcing her religion on him. It was really a custom, a standard practice for a royal marriage in the ancient Near East, that the husband does placate the wife in terms of her religious affiliations. And so the king, he was expected to provide in this situation for his wife's worship. But the difference here is that Jezebel, she didn't just worship quietly, she sort of institutionalized it. She made it even more a part of the government of the state. And it's getting specific here, but when Baal that Jezebel worshipped, she was not, as I mentioned in the previous video, it was not the generic Canaanite Baal that the Israelites sometimes mixed actually with Yahweh worship. It was Melkart, and we talked about the specific Baal of Tyre. And Melkart, as we said, it means king of the city. So he was the actual patron god of Tyre. And his worship was tied to the monarchy itself. So very much intertwined. And he, as I went through in that previous video, which is what, he was a dying and rising god. And his death and resurrection, they were celebrated in this annual festival called the Agersis, or the Awakening. And this festival involved these cultic rituals where there was ecstatic worship and there was self-mutilation by the priests. And this is exactly the kind of behavior we see in 1 Kings 18 when the prophets of Baal cut themselves and they cried out to their God when facing Elijah. And so Jezebel, she maintained 450 prophets of this Baal, of Melkart. And then she also had another 400 prophets of Asherah at her table. So she had 850 religious professionals that were sort of employed, funded by the state, the government. And so these weren't really fringe figures. They were royal chaplains, they were temple officials, they were advisors in the highest level echelons of the government. And so it was not some private religious preference she was living out. It was really a state-sponsored religious establishment. It was competing directly with the prophets of Yahweh, and really for the entire soul of Israel. And so this is where everything stemmed from. This is where the conflict begins. And the situation was, it was a bit more complex, you have to say, than just good Yahweh versus evil Baal priests that we see. But many Israelites already worshiped a form of Baal at that time. It was the local Canaanite Baal, and it sort of had been syncretized with Yahweh, actually, I think, for centuries. So the lines were a bit blurred there. And then the prophet Hosea, he condemned this act, or this practice. But Melkart, he was different. He was a foreign state god. He was imported from Tyre. And Jezebel's prophets didn't just coexist. They actively persecuted all the prophets of Yahweh. So in 1 Kings 18:4 tells us that Jezebel cut off the prophets of Yahweh. She had them killed. And the palace officials in Obadiah, he hid 100 of them in a cave, the Yahweh priests. And so feeding them bread and water to keep them just alive. This is the context of the confrontation on Mount Carmel that leading up to it. And it really wasn't a theological debate at all. It was really sort of a state-sponsored religious purge that was going on. And the opposition, the Yahweh priests, they were fighting for their lives, just fighting for survival. And so by the time Elijah steps onto the page, so to speak, the kingdom of Israel, it's already in the middle of this religious war back and forth. And the queen has the power. She has the money. She has all the prophets. And the Yahweh faithful, they're out there hiding in caves. It's quite a contrast. You can see who's really favored to win this battle, you would think, without a doubt. And so this is the world that Jezebel really created. And she, you have to say, she didn't necessarily do it out of malice, but she was doing exactly really what any Phoenician queen would have done when she brought her gods over. And she protected these priests, and really she used the power of the throne to advance her religion, was the idea. And the question was, would the God of Israel survive through this? And so it was really a life or death confrontation for all of Israel. And so Elijah, he ends up defeating, of course, these 450 prophets of Baal. And it was really the most dramatic showdown when you put all that context to it, not to mention how much of a victory it was for Yahweh. But it was the most dramatic showdown in the entire Old Testament. Fire came down from heaven. The people shouted, Yahweh, he is God. And the prophets, they ended up being executed of Baal at the Kishon River. So it was the greatest victory of Elijah's life. And then, as we know, in the aftermath of that, a messenger came to him, and just one sentence from the queen. And Elijah, the man who just called down the fire from heaven, he was on the run for his life. He was in absolute fear of what was coming. And you have to say, why would that be? It just seems that this major victory happened. Things should really turn around, especially proved that Yahweh was, why Yahweh is the God. Why would be terrified of this woman? And so the answer changes everything you really think you know about the story, really, when you look at why he was in fear. But when you look at, as I said, the context at that time, leading up to that, there was 3 years of drought in the land, and Ahab and Jezebel, they had been hunting Yahweh's prophets for that entire time. And then Obadiah said he's hiding them in caves. And the entire kingdom is really spiritually divided. You have left and right, blue and red. And Elijah, he actually appears before Ahab and he proposes the contest in this context. And he just says, 2 altars, 2 bulls, no fire. And the God who answers by fire, he is the real God. And so the 450 prophets of Baal, when we get down to the showdown, they go first. They do their dancing around, their ritual dancing. They do it around the altar, and they're cutting themselves, mutilating. They cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood is just gushing out. And so this is this ecstatic worship of milk carts I mentioned. It's the same ritual that it's recognized in the Phoenician texts, but nothing happens. There's no answer, there's no fire. And then Elijah, of course, he comes and he repairs the altar that they've messed up. And he puts it 12 stones down. He digs a trench and he pours water over the entire sacrifice, not once but 3 times. And so until the water fills the entire trench. And then, of course, he prays. And then the fire, of course, comes down from heaven and it consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, all the water in the trench. And the people at this point, they just fall on their faces and they recognize Yahweh, he is God. And then Elijah orders the prophets of Baal seized, and they're taken down. The people take them, and of course, I said, they take them down the Kishon River and they just execute every single one of them, all 450 of them. And so this is Elijah's really greatest moments. What a victory. And then all of a sudden things just fall apart immediately in the aftermath, as I said, with that one sentence from the queen. And so when Ahab returns to Jezreel, he tells Jezebel everything about what happened. The failed sacrifice, the fire from heaven, and the execution ultimately of all the prophets. And so most people would think Jezebel's probably just going to recoil. She's going to collapse in despair. But she does the opposite. She sends a messenger to Elijah with one sentence, as I said. It just said, may the gods do to me and more if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them. And so that's it. It's not a curse of any sort. There's no magic to it. There's no incantation. It's just a threat. It's a promise, and that he's going to die. And Elijah, the prophet who just called the fire down from heaven, he is running. He takes it seriously. And he flees, as the Bible tells us, to Beersheba. And then he goes into the wilderness. As you know, he's sitting under, it's described as a broom tree, whatever that is, and he asked God just to let him die, just to be done with me. I've done my part. But why would he be giving up so easily, you would have to ask. And why run from a threat when he just defeated all these prophets? But the deeper answer is really the political situation. It's a political answer. That Jezebel, she wasn't really, in the end, she wasn't really a religious figure making a spiritual threat, but she was the queen. She was speaking with the authority of the entire state behind her, the king's seal. And the prophets of Baal, they were religious opponents for Elijah. And he defeated them with spiritual power. You can see it from that perspective. But what Jezebel was bringing, she controlled the army, she controlled the courts. And as I said, she had that king's seal behind her. So she could send out soldiers, she could issue legal orders, she could do whatever was required. And Elijah, he had no army, he had no palace, no political protection. So he wasn't really afraid of any magic. He was just afraid of her outright power, state-sponsored power. And so the most revealing story really about Jezebel's power, when we look at it, is this whole Naboth incident also. That Ahab, he wanted a vineyard next to his palace in Jezreel, and it belonged to this man named Naboth. And then Ahab offered him a great deal for it. He offered him to buy it, to trade for it, and Naboth refused each offer. And so it was actually his family inheritance. So at that time, in the context of it, under Israelite law, it really cannot be sold permanently. It remains in his family. And so Ahab he's in despair. He goes home, he sulks, he says. The Bible tells he lies in his bed. He turns his face to the wall and he refuses to eat. He's in that much depression. Jezebel finds him like this and asks, what's wrong? And when he tells her, she says something, I think, revealing. She says, do you now govern Israel? Are you really the king? Get up, eat, let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth. Okay? And I think at that point his countenance improved dramatically. And then Jezebel, she went about this by writing letters in Ahab's name and a seal on them. And she sends them out to the elders of Jezreel. And then she instructs them to proclaim a fast, to send Naboth in a prominent place, and then have him seated prominently, and bring 2 false witnesses and accuse him of cursing God and the king. Of course, all completely manufactured. And then the plot, it gets carried out. Naboth ends up getting stoned to death as a result of this. And there's all of his properties confiscated, and it's all given to Ahab. And so the chilling thing about this story is really that the procedure she used technically was legal. That don't necessarily look at the means, but look at the ends. And then this accusation of blasphemy, along with the 2 witnesses affirming it, and that led to the stoning outside the city. And so it all followed the legal code at that time. So Jezebel, she didn't of course murder him with a dagger. She just used the law itself as a weapon. That's what made her so dangerous. And that's why Elijah was so afraid of her. And she had really mastered this entire system. That she understood how to use the state's power to eliminate her enemies. And while at the same time appearing to follow all the rules, doing everything within the code, so to speak. And so when Elijah actually appears again, it happens this time in the vineyard itself of Naboth. But he pronounces judgment on Ahab and Jezebel. It says, thus says Yahweh, in the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth, dogs will lick your blood, yours. And specifically for Jezebel, he says, the dogs will eat Jezebel within the walls of Jezreel. And then it was about 3 years later, Ahab, he ended up dying in battle, and then his blood was washed from the chariot, from his chariot at the pool of Samaria. And the dogs ended up licking the blood off that chariot. So that was prophetically fulfilled. But we know that Jezebel, she lived on, they think, for about a decade. And then she continued really to rule through her sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram. And as I said, she's ruling through them. She seems to be doing fine, prospering for another decade. But the end ends up coming, as the story is famous, with Jehu, who was a military commander, and he was anointed by Elisha's prophet, and he leads a coup. So he kills Jehoram, and then he approaches the palace at Jezreel. And Jezebel knows that he's coming, And then she paints her eyes, it said, she arranges her hair, and then she looks out the window. This is probably where we get a lot of that seductress sort of caricature. And she calls down to him and says, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" And then Jehu looked up and he calls out, "Who is on my side? Who?" And then 2 or 3 of eunuchs, they look down, who are with Jezebel. He ordered them to throw her down, and they do it. And then her blood splatters the wall, and the horses trample her. And then later Jehu orders her burial. But she's a king's daughter after all. But when the servants, they go to find her body, they only find her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. So the dogs had eaten the rest before she could be buried. So the prophecy ended up being fulfilled as well. Exactly what happened, was stated, was prophetically said was going to happen to Jezebel happened. And then the Jewish historian Josephus also tells us that this fulfilled prophecy of Elijah, it also, having the lack of that proper burial, it was really the ultimate dishonor at the time in the ancient world. And so there's even more to it as well, but that part of it is oftentimes overlooked, that not only did the dogs eat her, but she got no burial. And then Jezebel, as we know, it was later used in Revelation 2:20 as a symbol of a false prophetess who leads God's people astray. So the name Jezebel, in that sense, it sort of became even more synonymous with promiscuity, manipulation, evil. Even though, as I said, the original Jezebel was never described, at least in Scripture, as sexually promiscuous in the Hebrew Bible. So she just sort of became a symbol, a sort of a cautionary tale, and in the end, a slur. So in the end, when we look at it, who was the real Jezebel? When we look back, we know she's a Phoenician princess. You got raised in this temple palace by a priest king, father, Baal, and she was a queen. She brought her gods with her, just as really all ancient queens would have done at that time. But she was politically brilliant, and she used the legal system to eliminate all of her enemies. So she wielded her power very effectively politically. And she was really so powerful that when you think about it, she sent the greatest prophet in the Bible on the run. And she was the villain of that story. But the story, you have to say, in this case, it was written by her enemies when you look at it in the broad context. And the writers, of course, there is always a theological agenda, if you want to call it agenda, but there's a theological unity that shows that Yahweh alone is God. And this does indeed tell that story. And that the foreign gods ultimately are always going to lead to destruction. And so in the story, really, Jezebel, of course, she's the ultimate antagonist. But historically, the woman behind the story, she's really far more complex than that, just that easier caricature that we oftentimes fall back to. So think about it in those terms. Next time you hear the word Jezebel, just used as an insult, remember, she was a queen, she refused to abandon her faith, and she was a woman who really wielded power in a world that didn't really want her to. And she, in the end, she was a figure so formidable that her name, it still does carry weight. It's 2,800 years later, and we're still very conscious of that name, and it has a very clear definition, delineation. But just think about the whole broad context. So that's it. That's Supernatural History episode on Jezebel. It's really been illuminating, and we're going to get into next, as I may have mentioned before, we're going to get a lot into Egyptology is coming up. So please subscribe, Supernatural History. Hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks.